morning. Welcome to the Drupal GovCon. I see some strong excitement out here in the audience, so thank you all for getting here so early. Thank you for waiting in line. This is testing your code as part of an industrial grade workflow. Obviously the heavy hitting topics to kick off the morning. We'll get going now. Some people will be walking in as we roll, but I think that the stuff we have is important, and let's dive into it. By way of introductions, my name is Matthew Cheney. This is Jody Hamilton. We've decided last night to start a cover band with the music we were just playing, but we also are professional Drupal web developers and have a great deal of experience working with workflows and website development and all the things we'll be talking about today. Typography, maybe not so much on the times, but everything else we'll get into. And this talk is about building an industrial grade workflow. It's about taking some basic concepts related to version control and pull requests and testing and putting it together in the kind of DevTest live soup to nuts process that I think both of us have seen professionally work very well for the projects that we've been privileged to work on. So to sort of highlight what we're going to sort of get into on this, I think we have some initial workflow and Git kind of conversation stuff I'll just set the basis for, because everything else sort of requires these things to get rolling. And then we're going to sort of talk, sort of back and forth and vibe on some of the different testing mechanisms that we've seen in our work and things that we might recommend to you, not only to use for testing, but to use in an automatic and robotic fashion. And then at the end, we'll do a little demo and just show you how this can sort of wire up in a way that makes sense for all of y'all. So let's sort of bust into this. So first thing up is that before the workflow, before you had version control, for people who are sort of working directly on production or working directly on a laptop and pushing to production, that life isn't as great as you might want. That there's a lot of problems that can crop in, problems some of you perhaps have seen in your work, where if you are just going directly into a production environment without an appropriate testing step, then you're going to be in a situation where you have a little more struggle because things are not always as they appear. Drupal in particular has a fun way of having something change over here and 1,000 other things happen over here. These are things that are difficult to always predict, things that are difficult to test for, unless you've built an industrial kind of workflow to do it.
And I think this is all about your level of risk, your comfort with how much risk your website organization is willing and should reasonably be taking, right? So if you are doing your personal website that nobody hardly ever looks at, you want to take a lot more risk. It's not going to be that big of a deal if it's down for a week, let alone if some little thing is busted that on one page, right? But if you are part of a big corporation or a big government agency with lots of people looking at your site and everyone's going to freak out if anything goes wrong, that's when your risk tolerance starts to go down and it starts to make more and more sense to add in all of these additional checks to make sure that there's less possibility for problems to make it to the live site.
Yeah. And so this is something I think DevTest Live that's become a relative standard inside of the Drupal development community and honestly the software development world in general. And this is something that I think for folks, and who by the way is doing some version of this right now, like DevTest Live. So awesome, good numbers of people. This is the kind of energy we want to see. But one of the things that and this is ground stakes. If you're not having this kind of thing, a lot of the other stuff is harder to sort of work with. But let's go a little bit kind of into this. Why we care about DevTest Live is that we need a place to actually do development work, to experiment with new modules or new techniques, to be able to try, to implement things and have people review them without messing up a live site or a production environment. But we also want the ability to have a very sort of code parity kind of a situation to do testing. One of the things I've seen a lot is that you can have very different results depending on what version of PHP you're running for a website. And so it's sort of not the best plan to have like PHP 7 on your laptop, but then push to a server that only has 5.6 because there's going to be differences there. And that's going to be true across web server configuration, HT access files, just maybe even just system resources that are available. And that, the closer you can have your testing to your production, the better you're going to be.
Yeah, you're never going to have your testing environment exactly the same as your production, and because there's always going to be some like third-party plugin that can only run on the live domain, and it's so it doesn't actually work right on the test environment. There's always going to be like some little thing like that. But every single thing that is, different on the test environment creates, more opportunities for chaos and unwanted problems. So the closer you can get the environments, less surprises you're going to have.
Yeah, and I think also a lot of workflow is about discipline. Some of the automatic testing we'll be talking about are things that you can use to actually reject code commits. So if you have a test that says the code needs to adhere to some kind of coding standard and someone tries to commit code that isn't that way, you can reject it as part of the workflow. And of course you can reject people editing code on the test or the live environment. That having that workflow helps to create a discipline so that the kinds of work you're doing is going through the proper way. And this is important if you're a developer of one, you're working on a website, you want to have your own personal discipline. But this gets much more important as we sort of build out this workflow beyond just a standard dev test live into something that looks more like this. So this is an implementation of a workflow where you actually have multiple different development environments because you often have multiple different developers and they need their own sandbox environments to work on different features or different bug fixes or different tests. And then you have this sort of process where all of their environments get integrated into a test environment for that formal review, and then it can be deployed to live. But one other part of this workflow that probably should stick out is this sort of sync item underneath, which is the way workflows typically work is you have the code go dev test live, but then you have the sort of content, the database, and the uploaded files. Those are things that are primarily being added to a live site, like new blog posts, new user profiles. And in order to properly test your site, you need to actually copy those items back to a dev environment as well. It's typically a very good plan to be working with as clean development environment as possible, as close to live as possible, so the more you can copy back, the better.
And this happens, this sort of two-way motion is happening for Drupal sites mainly because of the database and the fact that it's a CMS, so people the whole concept is that they're editing the content on the live environment. There are CMSs where you can edit the content on the dev environment, and then the idea is that it all gets pushed up to live. But the idea with Drupal was always that you edit on the live environment, things can immediately go live in terms of content, which some people would probably rather do it the other way, where they can test all of their changes on the dev environment before the content goes up. But that's really never been Drupal's inherent model. So because of this whole idea that the content gets done on live, it's kind of, you end up with this two-directional motion where the code is going one way and the content is going the other way. And then the problem is that in the database is also all of the configuration. So Drupal is really just like a series of forms that you're clicking through, and every single time you click and save, it's saving more configuration to the database. But the problem there is most people consider the configuration of their site to be more related to the code than to be related to the contents. The model really starts to not really make that much sense, and we talk about how we deal with that.
Yeah, lots of things in Drupal don't make a ton of sense. It's all about figuring out your own sort of vibe on it. But in order to get this kind of workflow set up, as you probably have experienced, you actually need to start to have a version control system. But the idea of saying I want to do a deployment from dev to test and test to live means that you can have some kind of predictability on what code is being deployed. So a good way to do this in Git is to actually go in and do a tag at a particular point and say, this is the tag we're going to be testing, this is the tag we're going to be deploying. And that, Git is a great kind of version control tool. It was obviously an excellent idea for the Drupal project to adopt it. Previously, Drupal had a version control system called CVS that ended up being pretty popular among developers. But the CVS sort of is more of like a sort of save state for your site, whereas Git is a very distributed system, as you might know. And the power of Git specifically is that you can have these individual branches.
How many people are using branches in Git? Okay, so everybody's pretty much using branches.
So branches, of course, can work something like this, where we have a master dev branch for which the canonical code is sort of existing, and then we can break off for individual features or individual kind of sandboxes.
And what I really like about working in branches is it creates this review point where you can do a review before you merge the branch into whatever your main branch is, whether that's master or production. And if you're all just kind of pushing to master and you kind of have all these different commits, there's no real clear place where you're supposed to be doing the review of someone's work, because their commits are all kind of mixed in with all the other ones, and you would kind of have to pick them all out and look at them. It's really easy to procrastinate doing that. A lot of people use GitHub or similar tools, which then introduces the idea of a pull request for a feature branch, and then that makes it really easy to go and do a review right there in GitHub before you merge the branch. So I think that's really important, because the best time to review code is as early as possible. While things are still fresh in everyone's mind, and before things get even more complicated with multiple problems going on.
And I think one thing that allows for sort of testing and review of individual branches is making sure inside of your workflow and inside of your development practice that you're able to create independent sandbox environments for each Git branch. That if you have a branch called feature 001, and you want somebody to review it, of course you want them to look at the code difference between the before and after state. That's obviously important. But you also need to be able to give them a URL and give them a place where they can look at that code specifically. That, being able to just especially in a CMS context, you need to be able to look at, the full PR and see what it does, so you can see if it meets the client requirements or business requirements. And so I would sort of encourage you as part of a workflow to make sure that every Git branch that you're doing has the ability to have a sort of test site or a development site along with it, because that'll not only allow you to work more efficiently within that branch, but it also allows some of the testing and review that we're talking about.
So I do a lot of review. And so my workflow used to be that somebody says that they do a pull request, or they say their branch is ready for review. And so I have to check out that branch on my local machine. But then, because it's Drupal and there's configuration changes involved, I also have to make sure I have the latest database, and then I run configuration updates or database updates. Then I have to make sure that I have the right testing content to be able to even test it. So every time I had to switch branches to take a look at something, it could take me 10 minutes just to look at it. So to make that and not only that, but I was sort of the developers were the only ones that could even do that, because you couldn't ask a project manager to check out the Git branch and then hope you don't have any conflicts and clear out your local and run the config import and do all those things. So I was kind of stuck doing the QA myself. So actually both Matt and I own businesses that have products that kind of solve that problem for you. So we, at my company, ZivTech, we started a continuous integration system called Probo that would, whenever you make a pull request, spin up a whole sandbox environment so that you could then just take a look at the site without doing anything. And he owns Pantheon, which has a system where it makes multi-dev environments, which you can also automate so that you can see every branch without doing additional work on your local.
Yeah, all of which you could also do on your own. This isn't particular proprietary magic. It's just very sort of plumbing for your websites, and something that, having that be set up is important, we think. And so here's my creepy GIF to suggest you should use Git. But as we sort of alluded to, one of the problems you're dealing with inside of development practice is that Drupal does have a lot of form clicking. and other kinds of pieces. Things that, maybe historically you sort of said, okay, if I'm going to deploy my changes to live, I'm going to have to I wrote down on a yellow legal pad next to my desk all the different clicking I did on the dev site, and when I go live, I just re-click that on the live site. Or maybe I copy and paste some views to export, or maybe I look at field settings on the dev site and I sort of look at the live site too and make sure the two screens match, things like this. And these are problems that obviously have had some sort of solutions historically. Their features module for Drupal 6 and 7, obviously very popular to store configuration. And then specifically Drupal 8's configuration management process that allows for really a lot of the workflow automation that we're talking about is possible because you can do this process of doing a deployment where all of the things that are having to happen to make the deployment can all be done automatically. That I can push a button to say deploy the code, and it'll move not only the code, but it'll also be able to translate sort of form clicks that maybe I would otherwise have to type into underlying configuration values. So for those that aren't wise, for the Drupal 8 configuration management, basically all the forms in Drupal, be it views or field settings or site settings, all can be reduced from sort of form fields that you would have to click through to individual YAML files that are defined not only in a machine-readable way, but in a way that can be checked in to version control and can be reviewed and tested along with all the other code.
So in case you're still mainly in Drupal 7 world and you're using features, this Drupal 8 configuration management is a whole lot better than features. Features is a nightmare, and it's very slow to work with features, and you kind of have to have this complicated mental model to even understand features because some things are CTools exportables and some things are not, and they work differently in features. So features has ruined our lives for many years, and so this configuration management I really think is the greatest thing about Drupal 8. When you move to Drupal 8. Managing the configuration becomes so much faster and it's more straightforward.
And for reasons that are very much about the overall architecture. That Drupal 8's configuration management is a core system. It's implemented for all things within inside the Drupal CMS. Features module had this problem of, because it was a contrib module, it was sort of constantly chasing all the other implementation possibilities. So it'd have to do special casing for views, special casing for CTools exportables. It'd have to have an addendum strong arm module to get variables in there. Drupal 8 says, no, we're going to do it one way, and we're going to do it a smart way, and this is what we have. So these are just a bunch of YAML files. This is sort of a standard Drupal 8 install. Here's all the settings that you might end up seeing.
So, but to be clear, Drupal 8, just like previous versions of Drupal, it still reads the configuration out of the database. All of these files, these YAML files for the configuration, it doesn't read those as the settings. Those are only used to import settings changes into the database. So it's still the same model where it's keeping everything in the database. These are just used to move the settings to a different environment and then import them.
Yeah, so if you haven't gone through one of these deployments, you basically say, okay, I'm going to check all my configuration into the version control. I'm going to deploy it to my test environment. And then I'm going to go either in the GUI right here and basically say, okay, what configuration imports can I do? And Drupal will actually be able to tell me, oh, of all the configuration, these are some new things. So we have a new blog content type in this case, and here's something that's changed, which is some site settings. And you can even look at the diff of these files because they're pretty straightforward to diff, and you can actually get this kind of information. You can, of course, import it as well using a command line tool. This is what we'll wire up to our workflow, of course. Drush config import and config export sort of do the trick. Because the idea, again, is that in order to get the robots to do the testing and to do the automation for you, you have to make sure that a deployment does not require any human interaction. You can't automatically test something if in order to kick it off, you have to, or it's not a great idea to automatically test something if you have to spend some manual time every single time. So this is part of our thinking.
I don't really see deployment as the most important part of the workflow, right? So deployment is the time when things, can go wrong, right? So knowing that, everything we do in our development should be practicing for deployment. And it shouldn't just be like, oh yeah, we're developing, and then it's like, oh, now we have to figure out how to deploy it. Oh, surprise, surprise, we're going to have to deploy it. I mean, we know that ahead of time, right? So we should be thinking about that from the very beginning. And if we build into our workflow that everything is constantly simulating a deployment, then we won't have as many surprises at deployment because we've tested the deployment over and over. We don't run into the developer who says like, oh yeah, I forgot that there was that setting that needs to be changed when we deployed it. We already found out that he forgot that because we tested the deployment over and over as we were reviewing the work. So we just minimizes deployment surprises. So it gets to the point where you can go from some organizations' deployment is this unbelievable stressful thing that maybe they only do once a month or less, and they have everyone on call, and then they have like a bunch of people doing some manual checking, and everyone's nervous and upset, and even if it goes well, nobody feels like it went well. But you can move from that to a thing where like deployment is just not an issue at all. It happens constantly. Nobody thinks about it at all, and it's a lot less stressful.
And how do we reduce that stress? Well, of course, we actually get to testing our code. That as sort of like foundation to make any of this work, I think you need version control, you need to use Git branching, and you need to have an individual development environment for each branch, which as well as a workflow that can do configuration, export, and import. And if you have that kind of thing rolling, then all of this other testing becomes possible, and all of these kind of stresses that maybe are done with deployments become less. So here's some sort of testing automation that I think Jody and I sort of feel is sort of helpful. And the reason we feel helpful is that human labor and intelligent labor is obviously is in demand and is needed to get a lot of work done. But if you're asking sort of very experienced, software developers to do a lot of automatic or do a sort of very repetitive kind of stuff, they get very unhappy, and it's not the best situation. We will likely have the robots rise up against us. So in order to give them sort of cause for such things, let's make them test IE browser instead of having to deal.
And there's also something about like if you're doing a deployment, you might be able to say, oh, it literally takes me 2 minutes to do the deployment. I just run this, and then I run this, and I run this. But it really isn't like 2 minutes, because it's 2 minutes while you're like at your sharpest and you're really like remembering everything and thinking about the problem. I mean, it takes me like 3 hours just to get to that point. I'd like need like 6 cups of coffee. So it's like 2 minutes, like it's like 2 imaginary minutes of like perfect human form, that actually isn't that realistic.
And that like having tests run, can eventually become something where you have a lot of different tests. And we see organizations that we'll work with that literally have, thousands of tests that run on every deployment, because it's a cumulative kind of thing. As you sort of build more tests, you don't throw out the old ones, you just sort of keep them around, and the robots are happy to do the work for you. So one of maybe the oldest kind of testing that I think we can throw out there is cross-browser testing. Obviously, making websites accessible to the widest amount of users is important, certainly important in government, important honestly anywhere on the web. And cross-browser testing is something that's like honestly become less of a problem in my experience since in the last say 10 years. Browsers, or especially modern browsers, have a little more compatibility with each other, so that's excellent.
But it's kind of moved into more like testing
mobile phones, tablets. You need to test 5 different phones, 4 or even five of which you don't have.
Right. You can't even have all the phones, and so a lot of times you'll have a specific person high up in an organization that has some weird old phone, and they keep complaining about something nobody else can.
So instead of having to like get all these phones in your office or like spin up a lot of like weird VMs to get this all working, one of the things that can be really helpful is to actually automate this kind of process. And so you can obviously do biting on this monitor, which is not looks so great for the teeth. But one of the things that I think for testing that ends up making a ton of sense is not to try to reinvent any of this stuff. that like there are companies and services that are able to do cross-browser testing. They already do this at scale and have done for years. So, you know, if you want to go test 15 different browsers on your site, don't try to build that infrastructure yourself. Literally find someone else who has this kind of infrastructure, and typically find them with an infrastructure that's accessible by an API. A lot of the way the workflow magic can work is that you can have a situation where you're like, okay, I want to test this URL with these browsers. And many of these services will let you directly call an API and say go. And then it'll return to you the result set, either a link or some kind of data on this. And this is just the kind of thing where like if you want people to do cross-browser testing, instead of saying, here's a site, test it for these browsers, say, here's a link, look at it in 15 browsers, and then like check it if it's good or not. Like this is much easier to do.
I haven't used all those, but I use the browser stack one, and that one is really good. And you can just have different devices, but it's not just like a picture of it. You actually have like a whole browser in your browser, and you can click around to different pages. So
something we think to sort of bake in. Look, you're doing cross-browser testing. Many of these services have free tiers or very low-cost tiers. Build this in so every time you have a pull request, for example, you can see here's the link to see all the different browsers and how it would look. This is pretty important. Yeah, and you can get this is sort of an interface for one of these where you actually have, you know, different versions of Firefox and Chrome, and you can click in to each one. A pretty fun kind of testing, pretty straightforward. Another kind of testing that I think is really important to do as a sort of regular process is performance testing. Because it's actually one of the hardest things to sort of test for, because it's something you almost always need external services to do. You know, like if you're simulating 1,000 users coming to your site, like unless you want to spend the Bitcoin to get that time on the botnet to have 1,000 users do something, you're going to need to have somebody who already has that kind of infrastructure.
The other problem with performance testing is you a lot of times will think that your site is pretty fast because you have like the fastest internet in your house, and you have a brand new phone, and you're living in an urban area that has a really fast network, and it's just not representative of what your users are experiencing. Because if they've got an older phone and they don't have as good of a network, all of a sudden your page that seems to load super fast now takes 8 seconds, and that's just enough for them to not look at the site at all.
Yeah, looking at statistics for internet browsing is really interesting. Like, you know, especially globally, like, you know, over 70% of users are like on a 3G or less kind of connection, and that's not something that's going to change anytime soon. Like, these are phones that are slower, obviously render the DOM and just render like complex JavaScript a lot slower, and that, you know, these are things also where like sometimes the performance can just be hard to figure out in general, because again, if you change something in Drupal over here, other stuff can break or slow down, and it's hard to really identify this.
And we have all kinds of caching layers, and we have the front end and the back end and the JavaScript and the image side. I mean, I find the performance is one of the biggest challenges to improve. But if you're going to do the testing of it, you should use a third-party service that will kind of simulate a standard speed, so you can kind of compare things instead of having all the variables of like how your network is doing that day.
And here are some performance testing tools and services that offer this kind of thing. These are folks that have been around for a long time, that have their own infrastructures to do testing, and also have some awareness of like the CMS application. That like testing isn't always just hit the home page 1,000 times and see how good it is. It can be, we need users to be logging in at some frequency. We need comments to be posted here. We need people to use a search interface. We need to use the, try e-commerce checkout. Like, then building out these test plans, which is actually not too crazy. Like, there's like, little Chrome extensions you can use to actually record specific scenarios. So Jody and I worked on this website for a bicycle store. The bicycle store obviously needs to have testing when you deploy new stuff. But we don't want to just make sure the front page is really fast. We want to make sure the whole e-commerce experience is functional and fast. So we have a recording of an individual user going through the process of buying a bicycle and then checking out. And this is the test that runs on the regular and reports back that kind of performance, these performance metrics. Because a lot of what I think you're trying to do is just get a baseline. You want to be able to say, every time I do a deployment, how fast is my site performing compared to the last time I did a deployment? Because then if there's an issue, if something's changed, you can try to identify much quicker the stuff that's added. Was it some new code that was added that caused some more complexity, a new module that maybe did some weird breaks to your caching? And that the closer you can do to, you don't want someone to call and say, the site's really slow, let's try to figure out what's happened last month. You want a robot, literally every time you do deployment, to do a quick test and report back.
Another easy way to do a performance test is if you use Chrome and you go in the DevTools, which I kind of live in, their tool Lighthouse, they've actually brought it into DevTools now. So all you have to do is open up your DevTools on the side, and then you have to scroll over to this tab that says Audit. Yeah, switch to your Chrome. I didn't know this for a while because you don't see it right away. You have to kind of scroll over. So go to Inspect.
So yeah. This is a free tool.
See, it says Elements Console Network Performance. Hit the arrow after the performance, and then it says Audits. And then you just press Run Audits, and it does performance, but it also does accessibility and some other things. And it's pretty fast. So you can just, that's really easy, low barrier to running that one.
So why can this be helpful? Well, again, in terms of our workflow, what if we have something that looks like this, which is we have a sort of story that says, hey, we want to improve performance on the site, so we identify there's some JavaScript libraries that are loading unnecessarily on certain pages. Loading more code and doing more stuff obviously is going to slow down the site. So we ask our friendly developer, Mr. Mike Herschel, who's here, who helped us with the project, to say, okay, let's go remove the JavaScript. So he does a commit. And then as part of our pull request on GitHub, as part of what we're seeing, we have an automatic bot run, and it actually does a straight up test for both performance and accessibility and some other web best practices. And it'll give us a number.
So Lighthouse has a command line interface, so you can set that up as part of your process. So this one probably comes from Travis CI. So Travis CI has a Lighthouse integration, so that it'll send this back to GitHub and show you the numbers right there.
And this is great too. If you're if you're a project manager, or if you're just trying to lead developer, and you want to say, oh, how did we improve performance? Well, you can go obviously look at this specific report, but you can also sort of track over time what that performance number is. 29, honestly, not that good, but if that was where your baseline was and you still are at 29, it's probably not a problem. If the last time you did this was 50, then this is meaningful, and this is something that you can get into. And having that information, not something that you can get, going to Chrome, hitting audits, doing run, that's not a huge amount of time. But it's something you might not do if you're busy. It's something that there won't be a record of that over time. And it's something that if it just takes a little time and that adds up, this just is really, really fast.
Yeah, and there could be a reason why, your performance is really, really critical, that if it falls down a little bit, your company could lose a lot of money, and so you would want to have people monitoring this before you do any deployment.
Yeah. So automating performance as well as accessibility, which we'll chat about. These are very good. These are very good plans, and things that are actually with Lighthouse specifically free and easy to integrate, and this helps a lot, at least in my work. Another kind of testing that I find very helpful for certain applications is visual regression testing. It's basically a sort of machine vision comparison between two pictures. So you basically can take version 1, a dev site, picture of the homepage, version 2, the live site, picture of the homepage, and you can do pixel comparisons. So maybe we have these two sites, our dev and our live site. And maybe what we've done is we've said, okay, we want to change the color of the links. They're blue and black on the left, and we actually change them to green on the right. Okay? Kind of ticket you might get asked as a developer to solve. Now, the issue here is that, of course, when we're doing a test, we want to actually identify what's different. So we can run this kind of machine-like logic, and it'll highlight the areas that are different pixels. Now, the fact there's different pixels is not in itself a problem. where most of the job we do as web developers are to move pixels around the screen. But what it lets us do is when we review the specific change, we can see which pixels have been changed on which pages and identify and sort of make a human judgment on if that's good or bad. So, for example, if we only tried to change the home page, but our report says we've changed 10 other pages by accident, which isn't that hard to do in CSS, then we can identify that. In this case, I really like because you'll see here, of course, we want to change the titles, like I was saying, but there's that little read more link up under vegetables or grade on the side. Now that happens to have an A tag, so if we targeted an A tag on this page to make it a color, it would change that, but maybe we didn't want the read more to have that style. The idea is that we can identify this quite specifically.
So I really like the visual regression testing because it's really fast and gives you a lot of information on all kinds of things, anything that changed visually, and ultimately most of what we're putting out is for visual consumption. So it will there's this sort of tendency when you're working on a project for there to be some creep away from what the original design was, because you're just, things are getting changed. There's big complicated CSS, and over time the spacings will kind of change a little bit and wander from where they originally were, and nobody can really notice it happening because it happens one small change at a time. So if people are very focus on pixel perfect. For example, sometimes I have a client who is very eagle eye, and they will just notice things that I would never see, or they might notice that a font has changed or a font isn't loading, and I will never notice that without a tool like this. But the other amazing thing about it is it catches things that are not really visual regression tests. That it's not really a visual thing. It'll catch if you did a module update and it broke your search interface and nobody went around and clicked on every page on your site to see if anything broke, your visual regression can easily catch stuff like that too.
Yeah, I think that's actually the best use case for visual regression, is to test updates, and specifically security updates, because it's almost never the case that a security update is going to change the look of your site. It's just going to patch some SQL queries or do some filtering somewhere. So I've set up plenty of projects where literally every time a security update for Drupal comes out, we'll run a relatively robust kind of test using something like Wraith, which is sort of the original visual regression testing, or any of these other tools to do visual regression testing. And something like Backtrack, which I think is up there, yeah, they have a whole service. They actually have the ability to say, look, here's my dev and here's my live site. And it'll actually crawl your sitemap and take what it considers the most important pages. And every time you call their API, it'll do a comparative test. So new Drupal security update comes out. I spin up a sort of independent environment to review that. And then I do a visual comparison between the updated site and the live site. And if there's no pixel difference, if literally every pixel is the same, that means no white screen of death. It means no error messages, because those are pixels. It means the search box is still there, all the elements are still there. If all that looks the same on 20 pages, that's better than what I do normally, which is just click around for a while and make sure it doesn't look bad. So you can sort of use this process to automatic that. So in my case, if it passes all these tests, I just deploy the thing, no problem. And that's a great way to sort of...
A lot of these tools also let you sort of black out areas because they're dynamically changing and you don't want to get these false positives. So you can kind of black out your carousel or your news content so that it doesn't take a look at those parts of it.
Yeah. And there's this isn't a bulletproof kind of example too, because you might want to black out ad regions or things that are going to random quotes, things that are going to change every time. This is a way you can sort of do it.
And a lot of them also let you kind of do it on multiple devices at the same time, so you could kind of do it on a mobile display as well as a wider display.
So if I want to actually try to figure out how would this work in my workflow, here's another example. Okay, we're on the same project, we're upgrading a font awesome to version 5. Now, this shouldn't change the fonts, right? We're just upgrading the package for security or other reasons. So we can have a pull request that goes in and says, okay, let's go update the package. And then you'll see at the bottom it has a visual regression report. And that will actually give us different pictures where we can do comparisons between the different items. So in this case, we actually see that the checkmark icons become changed as the update happened. Now, maybe this isn't a huge problem. Maybe we do think, oh, this is a little bit offset. This isn't any good. But the idea is that Quick Sketch here, who's trying to figure this out, he doesn't have to go into the site and load up 2 versions of something and try to see if they make sense. He literally has a report that can highlight this, and then you can talk about it right in the pull request. So it's okay, great. We're going to go fix that error. Here's another thing, and then it reruns the test so we can actually see, oh yeah, that looks really good. And all of these kind of things are things that humans can test themselves, but humans aren't as effective as robots in a lot of these cases, and they're prone to irritation in many of these cases. And just at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff to do on the web. We don't have time for a lot of this manual stuff. The more robotic stuff that we can do, the more consistent our testing is going to be, and honestly, the better our work product's going to be. And the more you get that integrated into a sort of PR kind of thinking, the easier it is to have conversations like this that require very little other work than just typing and looking, and that's sort of what we're up to. And testing can go well beyond just sort of obvious breakages and stuff. Testing can be used to maintain overall quality. So one test that I often put into my workflows to really make it, I feel, truly industrial is just running a sort of coding standard sort of review against the Drupal official coding standards for code that's working on my Drupal projects. So Drupal has a set of coding standards, stuff around spacing, making sure every function has a comment, and various other kinds of things. It improves code readability, standardability, stuff like this. Now, the problem is after a while, your site can get really crazy if you don't enforce these standards. So one option you can do is that every time there's a pull request, you could point out oh, here's potential coding standard violations. Now, maybe you don't care that much, tab spaces, whatever, but you could at least tell people that's happening, or you could even reject commits if they meet a certain sort of lack of standards. And you could do this for JavaScript with linting. You could do this for any kind of code you're writing, CSS. And it's a good thing too if you have a larger team, especially you're training new people on the team. It's a good way to sort of give them quick feedback on their pull request and gives them the ability to improve it as you go. So code linting with Coder, and Coder module has a command line interface, pretty straightforward to do. You can even go, obviously security is going to be really important in the world of all websites, but obviously government kind of websites. And having services like this is a tinfoil security, not to suggest they're the best at this, but they offer a scan where you can literally just put your website URL in, and it'll do things like check to see if you're vulnerable to Drupal get-in attacks or cross-site scripting attacks, or if you have weird cookies being set, or if admin pages can be logged in, or if common passwords are used for admin accounts. And that this is just something every time you do a pull request, you could have these people do a little scan and get a report back. And hopefully it's always fine, but if it's not fine, this is an actionable kind of piece of testing. And then the last sort of bit we'd throw out there, obviously accessibility testing is really important. We were talking before about Lighthouse. Lighthouse has great accessibility kind of properties.
So accessibility is required by the ADA for anyone that does public accommodations, right? So that's government, schools, even restaurants, stores, anyone that's kind of serving the public. You could get sued if your site is not accessible. And so the main things, the main types of accessibility really are, I think, people who can't use a mouse and they're kind of tabbing through your site. So that's a really easy thing to just check, get in the habit of sometimes just navigating your site by tabbing around instead of using your mouse. And then the other one is visually impaired, and making sure that there's enough information there that serves people that can't see the whole context and start to understand how they are experiencing the site.
Yeah, and there's clear standards for these kind of things. These are things robots can review and tell you if you've done accessibility work. And why not in every pull request tell people, did this make accessibility better or worse?
I find fixing accessibility is not actually that difficult or complicated. It's a lot easier than improving your performance. It's fixing, if you make your site follow best practices and it's built on Drupal, which is built with a lot of accessibility tools in it already, you can get to 100% accessibility scores on these tools pretty easily. So. I use the Lighthouse accessibility testing, and there's also a tool called Wave for accessibility testing. But ultimately, you can't use just the automated tools. Like, you really do need to have like accessibility audit as well if that's a high risk for your organization.
Yeah. So I think the sort of over/under here is, as you build out a workflow, make sure every time you do a deployment that you can kick off a series of automatic tests, and that those can depend on the needs and the risks that you as an organization want to take on, but that building it once and running it regularly is going to cause you to have a lot more happiness with your development process and produce better work product. So in the last minute or so, just to sort of run through how this could look, here's some sort of testing that I've set up on this project. And the idea is that you can also try to make these tests sort of chatty. Like putting the test results in pull requests is a really good plan, or putting the test results inside of Slack. Like, make them visually surface to the people who actually can fix them. So in this case, we have this process where, okay, we're going to go ahead and change the ticket color, or do some git commit here to change the color. And then we're going to go ahead and kick off, this is BHAT's, another kind of test, but it's like a behavioral test to say, does this particular thing show up? And then we can actually report back if it works or not. Then we can do a deployment, and we can check, are there any configuration files? And we can then automatically import those configuration files. We can then do a little bit of New Relic to identify that there's a deployment happening. And then right here, we actually are running that performance test right automatically. Oh, sorry. Every single time. Now we're only doing this for 30 seconds or 60 seconds, which is not the fastest. But the idea is that every pull request that we have and every deployment we have gets that kind of test result, and this allows us to get feedback. And so it's the kind of thing where if that all passes, it's pretty straightforward to do deployments and then actually deploy it again to live environment, where again it'll actually change those configurations. Because so much of this work is all of this stuff are things that you'd have to manually do before, but being able to sort of kick off visual regression tests automatically and see if things are different can really help your overall kind of situation. And so I'd say sort of in closing that making your workflow as industrial as possible is very helpful, and part of that industrialization, as you can see, is a great deal of robotic automation. So I would say from some of the tests we talked about, as well as others you can get, find the ones that make sense for your project, build them into your workflow, and more truth, beauty, and wisdom to all of you.
I think we're running a little bit late, so we're not going to do questions. If you have questions, just come up.
We are here all for the next 3 days. Come chat with us upstairs, and of course, have a fabulous GovCon. Thank you, everyone, for paying attention.